I'm Dr. Pete Economo, the East Coast psychologist,
And I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin, the West Coast psychologist.
and this is When East
Meets West.
Hey, Nikki. So, what about some perspective taking and how that affects all of our lives?
I think this is really important to talk about. We've mentioned it a lot of times. And, you and I were just saying, I can't believe we haven't done an episode on this yet.
I mean, how many times do we say that, though?
we say it a lot.
That's going to get old.
Well, sorry, listeners. Well, I think it's a good example of how everything is like interwoven, it's like a pulley system. But yeah, we need to talk about this today because perspective taking is a really essential behavior actually for well-being and our relationships.
Yes. Well, and it's especially for relationships, like you said. I guess we'll bring in maybe some examples of it.
Mhm.
So, welcome listeners. And so today we're going to introduce the behavioral aspects of perspective taking. I don't know actually what the Eastern, I guess we'll see what arises as we talk about that. I'm not sure how the East will meet the West in that category, but maybe you'll give us some nuggets of knowledge around that.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I was going to say, I think, I bet you what's maybe going to kind of arise is it's sort of like why we talk about this lovely partnership between behaviorism and Eastern spirituality, because it is perspective taking is a behavior, right? It's a covert behavior, though that is something that's involved, I think, in a lot of the practices, like in Buddhism, for example. So maybe that's not the language that's used, but I'm sure you'll have lots to say.
It's also an annoying word to type, but if for anyone out there is not a strong typer like myself, but so perspective is a particular attitude toward or way of regarding something. It's a point of view.
Mhm.
So the way we think about it today, maybe I'll ask you, Nikki, like
Mhm.
how you define it with clients, but is looking at how our worldview. That's the way that I formulate it. Is like it's perspective is the way in which you see the world, and there's no one right way to see the world.
Right.
Yet we all see the world from a different perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's maybe I'll add like another way to say it. It's a vantage point, right?
Yes.
It's a vantage point.
Mhm.
So yeah, no, when I'm talking about it in therapy, I mean, I of course, again, just as I just said a moment ago, I explain it's a behavior that we can cultivate and learn to do, and it's a covert behavior. No one can see you perspective take. It's happening
Mhm.
inside your body,
Mhm.
and that you're sort of the simplest way to put it. I'll say is it's the old like putting yourself in someone else's shoes.
Yes.
Like that's what you're doing.
Well, so then how I'm thinking as you're saying that is like, what's the difference then? So is in some way
Mhm.
perspective is also it's empathy.
You were literally
I
reading my
can't.
mind.
I
Yeah,
can't that we are
you were literally reading my mind. Yeah, well,
guys.
it's
Our producers did not do this.
it's the magic of psychic communication here, or telepathy.
Yeah.
So yeah, well, it's required for empathy, I think is what we
I
could
see.
say,
Yes.
right? It's that I would sort of say that because empathy, we've talked about this before. Empathy is also about it's like feeling what somebody else is feeling as if it's
Yeah.
happening to you, and
Right.
perspective taking is the behavioral component of
Yes.
putting yourself in someone's vantage point. So that isn't necessarily it's not limited to just feelings. It's also incorporates uh, perspective, thoughts, and
Yeah.
sort of like even sort of like visualizing what someone might be experiencing.
It might actually be important to differentiate them because then really I would say perspective is more like sympathy then. So just for listeners, when we differentiate sympathy from empathy, empathy is being able to truly feel someone else's emotions, whereas sympathy is being able to observe or acknowledge or validate one's emotions.
Sure. So I think that would be, so that's maybe an example of perspective taking is required for both of those practices,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
It's just that empathy isn't equivalent to perspective taking, right? It's like perspective taking is necessary to practice empathy. It's also necessary to practice sympathy. It's also
Yep.
necessary to practice even, I feel like you're gonna laugh when I say this because I'll use the example that comes to my mind. Even like spatial relations, if you're trying to imagine if if I'm imagining what Pete is viewing right now looking at the screen, it requires
Mhm.
perspective taking on my part, like
That's right.
putting myself in his shoes, like what would he be looking at through his own eyes.
Yes.
So I bring up that example because I think about sort of like Psych 101, like
Yeah.
when we're, and if anybody's out there took, undergrad psych or was a psych major, a lot of times you'll learn about Piaget, who was a developmental psychologist. And one of the, probably definitely going to mess up the stages of development here, but the stage that's like age 3 to 5, is it pre-operational stage? I think is what it's called.
Sensory motor, pre-operational, operational.
Okay, pre-operational. My brain is serving me well. Okay, so
it always does. Who are you kidding?
Well, it's not 100% here. But the pre-operational stage is one of the things that a child at that age actually doesn't have a lot of perspective taking capability. Right. And so there's this famous study where they have a kid.
You read my mind.
I did. Actually, okay. So
I just wrote down here developmental.
Oh, you did? Amazing.
Egocentrism. Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. Egocentrism. Yeah. So basically what it is there's a study where it's like, you have a kid kind of like sitting in front of, not a diorama, but like a little, like imagine like a train set.
It's like a diorama anymore. I love it. You just said that.
I used to love making dioramas.
Of course
it is. So, but imagine like a train set or something like that. And imagine like on one side of the train set, there's a lake. And on the other side, there's a mountain. And it would be like, if the kid's sitting on the side with the lake looking at the mountain, and the researcher is sitting on the side with the mountain, you can ask the child that's ages 3 to 5, what does the researcher see? And what the kid will usually say is their own perspective. They'll say the researcher sees the mountain.
Right.
When it's like, no, the researcher sees the lake. And so as the brain develops, then the brain is able to perspective take and say, no, the researcher sees the lake instead. And so, perspective. So perspective taking, it is, it's a behavior, but that also does, it is affiliated with certain stages of development. Like when we're younger, we can't do it.
We don't have it. Right.
Yeah, we don't have it.
Yeah. Well, so just to clarify, so sensory motor, pre-operational, I said operational, but it's concrete, then formal. I thought there was a pre and then operate, but it's
not pre-operational. Oh, okay.
No, it is pre-operational. So sensory motors from birth to like 2 years old.
0 to 2, 3 to 5 pre-operational.
2 to 7 for pre-operational.
Oh, my bad.
7 to 11 for concrete, and then adolescence is formal. And this is why, like, I think it's important for listeners. Like, if you have kids around these age, that's why it's like, if you get annoyed at your child because they don't see that you're hurting or that you're stressed out, or it's not that they don't care or that they're like apathetic. It's because their brain actually can't.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you're saying that. It's interesting because that is something that I end up talking about with patients quite a bit.
Of course,
because, exactly that. And then I'll use the language. I'll say they cannot perspective take, I'll say even when they're older. Like, so an adolescent, think about listeners, like when you were younger. We've talked a lot on here about how when we're younger, we think more linearly, right? And we're more sort of black and white in our thinking. Well, that's the antithesis of perspective taking, right? Like, so because you're focused just on your perspective. And so even though, for example, adolescents they have the capability to perspective take more than a 5-year-old can, they're still not as skilled as someone who's 30, for example, right? Exactly. Their brain isn't done growing. So, it's both something that is, it's going to get better with age, and perspective taking is a behavior we can become stronger at, we can cultivate.
Yeah. And over time, I guess that's part of, the thing I've been noticing, I'm saying more and more, is like, what are you doing to exercise your brain? And the brain has to be exercised.
Yeah,
and
totally.
How else is it going to learn how to do that? And that's not just like getting cut off and trying to imagine that the person that just cut you off is stressed while you're driving or having a bad day or just lost someone they love.
Sure.
I think that's that like positive toxicity around some of this.
Toxic positivity.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I reversed it.
No, I love that. I like that too.
What did I say?
You said positive toxicity, which I also like. Just harder to say. It's just
it was hard to say.
That's harder to say. Yeah, I wanted to help you say it.
Thank you.
More easy. Yeah.
I appreciate you. And so it can't always just be like, oh, let me change my perspective because this person just hurt my feelings. Let me just understand where they came from. It's just that and what I find is, as I've exercised my brain through the practice of mindfulness, I'm able to just do this organically, where I'm less affected when, because some of the research shows that perspective taking will directly affect mood.
100%. And I think, and I appreciate what you're saying, Pete, though I think I would gently challenge and say, I don't necessarily think you're doing it organically. I think it's like the muscle's stronger. So it's still effortful, right? And the reason I want to clarify that is I think sometimes, people will say, why is this so hard?
Right.
And it's like, well, it just like, if you go back to exercise, if you're a weightlifter and you can like bench press 100 pounds, if you've been doing that for a long time, they don't do it like with ease. It's not like, oh, wait, like bench pressing 100 pounds is the same as lifting 5 pounds. Like, no, it's very effortful, but you have the muscle to do it.
Right.
So it doesn't drain you necessarily in the same way that, if you never lifted 100 pounds before. Right.
Right. My
Right.
brain
So
is a little exercised at it. Yep.
yeah, your brain's exercised at it. So, and actually also something you just said, I think is important to highlight, which you said, it's not just about like you're driving, someone cuts you off and you're like, oh, that person might be having a bad day. You could do that. Right. But I think, again, perspective taking, it just, all it means is putting yourself at different vantage points.
Yes.
Right. Like just trying to understand. And so yes, it can be having compassion. Again, compassion also requires perspective taking.
Mhm.
Though it doesn't have to be that. It's just saying my vantage point isn't the only vantage point.
That's right.
Right. There are infinite vantage points, and putting yourself, even like, that's why I like the example of the Piaget study, right? Because you can even think of it like in a spatial relations way, right? It takes effort, right? If you're like whoever, if you're sitting in your house right now, imagine putting yourself on the other side of the room, and what would you be viewing from that vantage point? That
Right.
takes effort, right?
Yes.
That's perspective taking. We can do it in all kinds of ways.
Yes. Yeah. And so I think maybe you would talk, do you help people see this through cognitive distortions, or, kind of what some of the approaches that you might take around helping people exercise their muscle towards perspective taking?
Well, I think any kind of process where you are talking about different experiences other than one's own gives you the opportunity to practice this. So
Yes.
certainly in psychotherapy, we're doing that, right? Mindfulness, of course, I always share with people like that behavioral practice is going to help increase flexibility. So that's going to help.
Mhm.
So I wouldn't say I don't go after cognitive distortions. I'm asking people like it's more behavioral, right? Like what might that person's experience be in this situation? Like they're mad at their
Right.
partner for something. I'll say, okay, if you were in that situation, if the roles were flipped, right?
Yeah.
How would you feel?
Right.
Right.
Or what would you do?
Right. But so I think it's more about just the practice of putting yourself in someone else's shoes, which it's like, we can even practice that. For example, when we read literature, like I read like an article that was talking about, there's I'm not familiar with the article was referencing a study that people that read a lot of fiction have increased levels of empathy.
Oh, interesting.
Because you're reading
More
fiction,
creative.
well, not so much more creative. It's about perspective taking. You have to put yourself in the character's shoes, right?
Well,
Like you're
right.
Which I guess.
Well, I
also
think
creative.
fiction is more creative because, like, if it's, in my perspective, because I never really enjoyed reading fiction as much as nonfiction.
Sure, fair. And look, maybe if you were reading like memoir nonfiction, that would be. But it's more
right.
about the character. It's more about
Got
being
it.
in the mind of somebody. It's
Yes.
more to that point. So it's
Yeah.
like so so when I'm talking about it therapeutically, it's like I'm literally asking people to.
All right, I got one to stump you.
Tell me.
I think I'm going to stump you, but like, let's say you're trying to perspective take with someone who's being irrational.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Like there's really, yeah.
Just leave it there.
Yeah. You're gonna laugh. Doesn't stop me because that. So what I would say is another way of saying that would be somebody who's really rigidly attached to their own perspective.
Yeah.
And the reason that doesn't stop me is that that's usually what happens in therapy, right? That's usually because that's where we lie. So not lie, telling lies. That's where we find ourselves, where we fall.
I knew what you meant.
Yes. Well, to clarify for listeners.
Too.
Yeah.
They knew.
So it goes back to like, I'm going to validate them. I'm going to say, I'm going to perspective take. Actually, I'm going to understand why they're so stuck. I'm going to acknowledge their perspective. And then I'm going to try different avenues, right?
Yeah.
That might, and I think the one that tends to help a lot of people is when start with asking themselves, like put themselves in the situation. So it's like I said, like if you're mad at your partner about something, flip the roles. If it was happening to you, how would you feel? I don't know. What about you? What do you tend to do?
Yeah, same. I think that helps. I guess where I'm like, sometimes you do like family or couples work, you'll have that in the room. Like I find this is easier to do when you're one-on-one.
Yeah.
But when you have the actual like, disconnect or the different perspectives in the same room, it is challenging. So I think for listeners, like this is not an easy thing to overcome by any means. Like this is really, really, really challenging.
Well, and it's really challenging when we're feeling intense emotion, or we
Yeah.
believe something very passionately, right? Because we know intense emotion and, you know, beliefs we're really attached to, again, that's going to narrow perspective. We're going to get more
Yeah.
righteous, more rigid, more
I was
linear
just
about
thinking of
things.
like our righteousness
Yeah,
episode.
and a righteousness, I think we called it righteousness and rigidity because those
We
things
did.
go together, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's really important what Pete's saying. It's really hard to perspective take, especially when we really disagree with somebody
Yeah.
or we feel, you know, really angry about something. And the more we practice it, what do we do? Like, I guess this is important to say. So when we practice perspective taking, it is going to be a part of being more psychologically flexible,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And what do we know? We've said it many times here. Psychological flexibility is highly correlated with psychological well-being. It's
Yes.
the research around is very robust in that
Mhm.
regard. So I think that's something listeners can think about it, that if, you know, even though it's really hard to do, just like exercising your, you know, going lifting weights, when you exercise your brain, you practice perspective taking,
Yeah.
it is going to actually contribute to your own psychological wellness.
Yes. Yeah, that's great. You know, and so what comes to me as we're speaking, to bring in some of the Eastern stuff, it just came to me.
We knew it would. Yeah.
You knew it would. I did it. But I feel that the teaching that I've worked a little bit on is like no self. And so there's a teaching in the Eastern traditions that there is no self, you know, so philosophically you learn like there's no I, there's no, you know, so as a pronoun, I, me as a person, my identities. And so no self requires perspective because it requires that flexibility to understand that like I'm not even in an argument.
Yes, say more. I mean, I've liked this concept quite a bit, though it is probably one of the most difficult concepts
100%.
to connect with. So can you say a little bit more about why those things are interrelated? Because I'm going to guess there's a lot of listeners going like, what do you mean? What do you mean there's no I? Right.
Well, you know, if we think we're going to get that done in the next couple of minutes before we wrap up, you know, I think that's just not
a little bit of a tall order.
That's a tall order because it's something that, like, so if I've been studying this for like 15 years ish, I still don't fully get it. I get it intellectually, but I don't always feel it. You know, and so there are like non-self theory. There's a Mandala model of self. There are a couple teachings around what this means, and it's often, and in the Eastern tradition, they will teach about ego,
right?
You know, and how the ego is that which is involved. And so if I'm having, you know, again, I think we're looking at the negative behavioral stuff. So if I'm having an argument with somebody, I am feeling unhappy in my skin for whatever reason, that's often related to how I'm seeing myself, how I'm thinking I'm being seen by somebody else, you know, that ego piece of it. Or also like accomplishments, like, you know, the ego is what kind of drives some people to accomplish. So, you know, to achieve a high office in the company or to achieve a high office in politics. So these theories of non-self mean that none of that actually, and that's attachment to self, attachment to accomplishment.
Yes.
And we know this universal experience of suffering is caused by attachment.
Right. And so maybe like, and it's attachment, maybe I could say to like the concept of self, like if we use, you know, an acceptance and commitment therapy, you know, which obviously borrows very heavily from Eastern traditions, right? We actually say that folks can get, there's an attachment to the conceptualized self, which is really what Pete's describing, which is going to get in the way of looking at other perspectives because you're originally attached to your own. I do think it's important before we end. I don't think we can end this conversation without talking about mentalization, which is similar and also related to sort of some of the understanding and research around folks that are on the spectrum, which I know you have more knowledge about than I do. But mentalizing is a term you might, you know, also come across, which is again, it is also it's perspective taking. It's another name for it. Like there's even a therapy called mentalization based therapy.
I've never heard of that.
Oh, you haven't?
No.
Fonagy and Bates.
So smart.
It's used.
Fonagy, from 1998 to the capacity to reflect on and interpret one's behavior and that of others based on intentional internal mental states.
Yes, used and often used with borderline personality disorder. So it can also be used in combination with dialectical behavior therapy. But my understanding is like, you know, those that have a spectrum-based disorder, like mental, like just from a like a cognitive perspective, like there's difficulty mentalizing, right?
Yeah,
Difficulty putting oneself, like, again, going back to that Piagetian example, right?
Sure.
Putting yourself in another's perspective, right? Am I
Yeah, this is
right
beautiful.
about that? Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
you're beautiful. Yeah. Yeah, it's a big thing. And actually, like the Dalai Lama and some other sort of Eastern stuff has said that like holding on to your personal identity is a delusion. And so that will be like, I kind of want to drop the mic there because I think it'll be hard. Like that's how deep they go into letting go a non-self, because the idea of self is delusional. So, listeners, this is what we think about in terms of behavioral aspects of perspective taking. And sometimes a change of perspective is all that it takes to see the light.
This has been When East Meets West. I'm Dr. Pete Economo.
And I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin. Be present, be brave.
This has been When East Meets West. All material is based on opinion and educational training of Drs. Pete Economo and Nikki Rubin.
Content is for informational and educational purposes only.